What's going on, y'all? I'm KM Best, and these are my top 7 budget decks in Marvel Snap.
KM Best in a snap.
Before we start, a quick word on what I mean by budget. For me, budget really starts coming into play in the middle of Series 3. So when you hit about 600 collection level, you'll start queuing into people with more cards than you, and you need to, at that point, be smart with what you spend your tokens on. Especially given the potential changes in the future, you need to be smart with what you use your free card on. And hopefully these decks will give you a good idea of what cards are the most important ones in Series 3 and what you should be buying with your free Series 3 pull each month. Now, for those of you who are in Series 1 or 2, I would recommend checking out, for example, any DracZoo deck list. I have a link to my DracZoo build that I covered courtesy of Cleanup 141 down in the description below. So please check that out if that's what you're interested in. Now, let's jump into these Series 3 budget decks. Deck 1, Sera. Sera is built around its namesake, Sera, which allows you to play a lot of cards on turn 6. The build I have here has 4 Series 3 cards in it. These 4 Series 3 cards are Mysterio, Aero, Sera, and Maria Hill. Maria Hill is not necessary. Mysterio is not necessary. Even Aero is not necessarily necessary, although I do think she is the optimal option. Now, that means that there's a lot of flexibility in this build. You can pick and choose what cards you run in here, but the changes that you make will cascade throughout the rest of the deck. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, let's say you cut Mysterio. If you cut Mysterio, suddenly Bishop is a much worse option because those two cards tend to go together because Mysterio has great synergy with Bishop. Mysterio's absence would also mean that Nova might be a little bit of a worse option. It's going to have less bodies to target. You have to think about things like this. I'm not saying you have to cut Nova or you have to cut Bishop, but you could look for other options for Nova, for example. You could look for other options for Bishop, for example. I think I would tend towards, if you don't have Mysterio, I would definitely tend towards cutting Bishop before anything else. I still like the Killmonger Nova thing in basically all of my Sera decks, but it is worth talking about in the context of understanding how these changes cascade and how much they affect what you may want to play. Now, for example, Bishop gets a lot worse without Mysterio. Nova only gets a little worse. You have to think about things like that when you play a deck like this. This deck is a good deck for someone who likes to leverage unpredictability, because there are a lot of builds of this deck. There are builds that play Enchantress, there are builds that play Shang-Chi, there are builds that play Aero. You can see we're playing 2 of those cards there, but the fear of the unknown is something you get to leverage when you play this deck, and it is definitely important to understand that your opponents might be playing around something you don't even run. Now, there are other options for this deck. It's one of the most flexible Pool 3 decks you can have, but the main highlight here is Sera unlocks this archetype on her own, and you cannot play a Sera deck without Sera. That's what's important to know. Now, let's move on to deck 2. Deck number 2, Devil Dinosaur. This is a Series 2 hitter that has been upgraded for Series 3 gameplay, and you can make some changes if you'd like. There are only 4 Series 3 cards in it: Agent Coulson, Quinjet, Dr. Doom, and Aero. Of those, the only one I think is a lock that you need to have in the deck is Aero. Aero is just a phenomenal card for a deck like this that can get out ahead early and then slam the door shut using her ability. Now, Dr. Doom is just a good 6-drop. You could replace him with Magneto, another good 6-drop. You can also try, if you have the cards, running a Daredevil Professor X package in here. A lot of options when it comes to this deck in Pool 3 or early Pool 3. Now, you'll notice we aren't running Moon Girl here. You can totally put her back in. In fact, if you do put Moon Girl in here, you have the option of putting a Quinjet on the board, playing a Moon Girl, playing a Dr. Doom, and then playing another Dr. Doom. That's a powerful line. It might be correct to be putting in here. If it does go in here, you're probably going to end up replacing Agent Coulson. Now, that would bring this deck down to only 3 Series 3 cards, one of the most budget options on this list. Deck 3 is what I like to call HulkWave. It was popularized by W.W. Los, who goes by Double-Los or Wubba-Los, and it is effectively just a good cards deck that runs Wave and She-Hulk in it. You're leveraging the power of Wave and She-Hulk. So what you want to do here is play Wave on turn 5, floating 2 energy. This allows you to then play She-Hulk and another card after the wave, because She-Hulk will start at the 4 from the wave, discount to 2, and you can play that with your 6 energy along with another card that costs 4 from wave. The options we have in here for that card, Aero and Dr. Doom, they're strong as hell. Great options. Other than that, we just have a bunch of phenomenal cards in here. Cards that are above rate, cards that are great at taking priority, and cards that do the job you need them to do. Sunspot, Iceman, Scorpion, Lizard, Mr. Fantastic. These are classic, good cards. You play them on curve, you do the Wave She-Hulk thing at the end, you have a lot of flexibility in your matchups. Now, if you want to flex cards in and out, I would say the flex slots in here are White Queen and Shang-Chi, but I don't really know what you would replace them with because 4-drops are so weak right now. You'll notice a lot of the time when you play this, you're actually going to end up like maybe passing a turn 3 in order to play a She-Hulk on turn 4. It's just a little bit better sometimes unless your opponent has Shang-Chi. This is a very powerful deck, and I would definitely recommend it, budget or no, frankly, for anyone who's bored of the Shuri Thanos metagame. It is very strong. Continuing on our wave kick, we have a priority DeathWave build. Now, one thing that you'll notice that's different from the normal DeathWave builds, I don't run America Chavez and I don't run Shang-Chi. If you would like to, I believe the cut is Lizard here. What I've done is built this list specifically to take priority. Now, DeathWave tends to struggle in situations where it does not pull off Bucky into Carnage. Some of the things that prevent us from pulling off Bucky into Carnage include Armor and Cosmo. Now, what I built this deck to do was play Bucky and Carnage on turn 4 with priority, thanks to Lizard and Mr. Fantastic in those matchups. And in the matchups where we don't expect Armor and Cosmo, we can play the DeathWave deck as normal. You should note that Squirrel Girl is in here not just to make your death cheaper, it's also in here because it's like a bad Mr. Fantastic. It's good at threatening priority early. Squirrel Girl into Mr. Fantastic means you will almost certainly have priority on turn 4, but do be careful to make sure that you don't put Squirrel Girls and her squirrel into the locations that may mess you up. If you play a Squirrel Girl and suddenly a Space Throne comes up and you don't have a Killmonger to get out of it, you're in a little bit of trouble. Now, you'll notice this deck also plays Aero. This deck also plays Wave. This deck also plays She-Hulk. There are a lot of commonalities that I think it's worth taking my time to point out. You see a lot of Wave in these decks, you see a lot of She-Hulk in these decks, and you see especially a lot of Aero in these decks. And these 3 cards, along with Sera, are, I think, the slam dunk picks, barring balance changes, for what your first free monthly Series 3 card should be. It's gonna be one of those 4 unless you have all of them or a very compelling reason why it should not be one of those 4. Now, in that vein, since we've covered so many Aero decks, let's move on to a couple decks that have no Aero in them, because I know it's going to be a little bit more difficult to acquire her if you don't roll her with your first monthly series card. So let's check some out. Here we have what I consider to be a pet deck of mine. It's a DracZoo deck. The idea here is you have 0 to turn off your Red Skull, you have Dracula to eat your Infinite, and you have a lot of good 1-drops to go with your Khazar. This also helps you empty your hand, making the Dracula more reliable. Now, one major thing that this deck may be missing, jury's still out, is Kang the Conqueror. So if you do have that, feel free to chuck it in this deck. But for now, this is one of the most budget-friendly options that is available. Now, I will say, there are other ways to build Zoo. You can build Zoo with Enchantress and Shang-Chi to tech against other decks going big. Right now, I consider that a less viable option due to the prevalence of Leech in the metagame. This moves me more towards the Red Skull Infinite style of deck, because those are cards that are absolutely phenomenal when you get leeched on turn 4. They are outstanding cards when you get leeched on turn 4. So that's sort of where I'm at with Zoo right now. You'll note that this only runs 3 Series 3 cards. It is a very reasonable option. I think it is probably the most budgety deck in here, and it's definitely worth bringing attention to in that context. So in my search for decks that do not run Aero, but still run 6 or less Series 3 cards, I stumbled upon this archetype. It has been one that I have on and off tested, and it's definitely worth highlighting here because it is very powerful. It just strikes me as a little bit unrefined right now, but it's definitely worth pointing out that if you have the cards and you're looking for something like this, it's definitely an option. The way this deck wants to work is it is basically trying to play a magic on turn 5, pass turn 6, and then play an enormous amount of power on turn 7. It accomplishes this by copying demons from the hood, copying Titanias, copying She-Hulks. You get the idea. We also, of course, have the Infinite because if we're passing on turn 6, 20 power is a great deal. And we also have Sunspot because, again, if we're passing on turn 6, might as well get some value out of it. The rest of the cards in here are a little bit iffy, right? Like, there are some interesting things you can do. We have the Scarlet Witch that lets you play the Scarlet Witch Magic Juke game, should you ever be in a position to do that, turning off your own Limbo. We have a Viper that can give your opponent the hood. That's a good play, but a lot of the time you don't draw exactly those two cards, and you end up having to work around it. This is a reasonable deck. Figuring out what those remaining card slots are, I think, is really important. And I'm interested to see what y'all come up with when it comes to tuning this list. Finally, we have Patriot. Patriot is a secretly pretty heavy Series 3 deck, and it really relies especially on Patriot, Mystique, Ultron, and Doctor Doom. And even cards like Wasp and Debris I find are pretty important. This build of Patriot is meant to leverage Storm's power so that you have a little bit less vulnerability. This build of Patriot is meant to leverage Storm's power. So you not only have a little bit less vulnerability to location variance, you also have an inbuilt way to leverage your Doctor Doom, to leverage your Ultron, which are going to be able to put power on that stormed location no matter what. Now, it might be a little bit heavy. There might be too many 6-drops in here. That would be one worry that I have. I have seen other builds that go light on the 6-drops, run things like Mysterio, run things like Bast. But once we start doing that, we get very out of the range of what you would reasonably consider a budget deck. Just something to keep in mind for the future. Now, I think this is a very solid Patriot build if you happen to have these cards. Definitely something that's worth putting together in mid pool 3. And that brings me to the ethos of this video. I just wanted to get this in there somewhere. Defining budget in Marvel Snap is a little bit iffy. The option I have gone for here is to say we're looking at decks that are, mid Series 3. We're talking like 600 to 1500 collection level kind of things where you kind of have to make do. You can maybe pick one card out of the shop. You can maybe pick 2 cards out of the shop. Maybe you get lucky, maybe you don't. So these are more shells that you can work in. I do think the most flexible of them is the Sera shell. It makes her a very high priority target for me because you can make so many things work with her. There also, kind of almost goes without saying that Aero, Wave, She-Hulk up there in terms of targets for your first free Series 3 card with the update. If you need to know more about the update, you can check out my video below. There are going to be a couple links in the description, so please check me out there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed this look at my budget decks. Hit that like button, subscribe, all the things that make those little numbers go off and make my little brain go whir with the dopamine. Always very appreciated. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.